If you are a homeowner or thinking of buying a home in the United States, this video is for you. If you've been hearing all sorts of chatter and noise about new regulations and upheaval in the real estate industry, then this video is really for you. Goal today, I'm going to break down what's happening in the real estate landscape since a settlement was reached with the National Association of Realtors and several large brokerages earlier this year that put a handful of new processes and new regulations, if you will, in place starting August 17th of this year. Goal of the video, demystify what's going on, walk you through the big three changes of what's happening. And again, the backdrop of this, lawsuits that were filed, class action against the National Association of Realtors for the way they felt some of the practices had been in the past. And we're going to break through, demystify, unpack what it's going to look like going forward. So who am I and why should you listen to me? So my name's Mike Rolewicz. I run a real estate team in Jacksonville Beach, Florida with the Real Brokerage, which is a fast-growing cloud-based brokerage of over 20,000 agents nationwide. And our team has helped over 300 families to the tune of almost $200 million worth of real estate transactions in the last 4 years. So we've been following this closely, and my goal here in the next 15 or so minutes is really to walk you through what's changed, what stayed the same, and how we can help you navigate this new landscape. So as mentioned, goal of the video is really to break down the three biggest changes that are happening within the real estate industry in the United States. So three things every homeowner or potential home buyer needs to know going forward. I'm going to throw some graphs up here, do some drawings, some animation that'll hopefully help demystify again and make this a little bit easier. So of the changes, the first is that we're moving to a more formal representation environment up front, especially on the buy side. The sell side, the listing side has always had this. The buy side has been a little more informal. So this representation approach, which is the number one pillar of what's changing, is going to talk about what that looks like. Number two, and what was a big piece of the lawsuit and the allegations against the real estate industry as a whole, was the way compensation was paid. And what's going forward is going to be called a decoupling. It's going to get a little technical, but we're going to try and make it easy again with the help of some graphics. And the third are just some process and practice improvements that are coming out as a result of this that really are going to benefit consumers, homeowners, home sellers in the future. So the first thing we're going to talk about, looking at the graph here, is understanding representation. So the left-hand side shows what things were, and the right-hand side shows the future, which is, we'll call the post-NAR settlement or after August 17th world. So in the past, you'll see graphically top left here, a seller was entering into a formal agreement with a listing broker, listing agent. I'll use agent and broker interchangeably, where the seller would seek the services of a brokerage agent to help sell their home. They would enter into an agreement with an agent, with a brokerage that would really break down the responsibilities, the expectations of that agent brokerage, this package of services to get their home sold. Going forward, that's pretty much the same. Not much changes. The seller is going to enter into an agreement with the listing agent and brokerage to get the result they want, which is to sell their home with the least amount of hassle for the most money possible. On the buy side, this is where things are changing a little. And you'll see graphically here, we've got buyers 1, 2, and 3. They may not have had a formal relationship, a formal signed document, understanding, explaining what services that agent is going to provide for them. In the past, buyers would call agents that they may find through referrals, through references from friends, agents they've worked with in the past, online portals like Zillow. Buyers would reach out to these agents, say they want to go see a home. Agent would facilitate that process, show them homes, So you see the buyer goes to the agent gets these buyers into the home, and then move the process forward to get those folks to closing, which is the ultimate goal. Going forward, what changes is, you'll see on the right-hand side that before the buyer can legally see a home now, they will enter into some sort of brokerage relationship agreement with that agent. These could be exclusive, they could be non-exclusive, they can be property specific. We're not going to go deep in the weeds on it. Contact me offline, happy to walk you through what those options look like. But now the buyer is going to understand, here's the roles and responsibilities of this agent that's going to represent me in this transaction. Compensation is absolutely going to get discussed there. When we get to the decoupling of compensation here momentarily, we'll walk through what that looks like. But basically, there's a step in between where that potential buyer is going to engage with an agent to then go through that buying process, see properties, possibly make offers on properties, and then use that agent to, what I say, quarterback the deal to the closing table. So again, the past formal relationship between seller and listing agent or broker, mostly informal between buyer's agent and the buyer. Now, post August 17th, nothing changes on the sell side other than some forms that we'll cover in the third section. But what does change on the buy side is agents are now required to enter into a written agreement with potential buyers explaining roles, responsibilities, and what the process will look like before they're going to show homes. What types of property does this apply to? Residential real estate only. This does not apply to rentals. This does not apply to commercial real estate. Residential only. So next up, we're going to walk through what this decoupling of compensation looks like. Now that we understand the agreements, now we've got buyer with buyer's agent, seller with listing agent or broker. Good time to look at the three agreements that govern a transaction with the graph here. So the listing agreement, we mentioned that before. That is between seller and listing agent or broker. Again, interchangeable. Brokerages sell properties. Listing agents are the licensees of those brokers. So when I say they're listing agent or listing broker, same on the buy side. It's the organization helping the individual, if you want to think of it that way. So you've got a listing agreement between seller and listing agent or broker. Next, we now have this buyer agreement. That's an agreement entered into between the buyer and the buyer agent / brokerage. The third agreement is the purchase agreement, and that is thought of as the offer or the contract. So this is where buyer and seller begin to negotiate the terms of a purchase of that property. That can include many things, right? Personal property. When do we want to close on the property? Are the sellers going to be out of the property on the close date? How much time do we need to get the loan? So all of those items are covered in that purchase agreement. And you'll see here shortly how that purchase agreement is now going to have an extra layer to it that's going to address some compensation because, as we talked about, next up, we're going to talk what a decoupling of compensation actually looks like. So now we're going to demystify the best we can how things were, how they're going to look going forward. So again, left hand is the past, right hand of the graph is the future. So the way the process used to work is when that seller would sign a listing agreement, they would agree to a total commission, total fee for services for the sale of their property. So rather than use percentages, I think dollars are a little more straightforward. So let's say, for instance, a seller wants to sell their property and the percentages work out to where the total compensation they're willing to offer to get the home sold, that's going to cover the fees, commissions for both their side of it and actually for a buyer's agent that would facilitate the transaction on the buy side. Let's say that was $20,000 total. So you'll see seller is going to give to that listing agent, listing broker, a total of $20,000. In the past, there was what was called cooperation compensation or co-op compensation, where the listing agent, listing brokerage, would then give a portion of that $20,000 to the buyer's agent or buyer's broker in that transaction. So in this case, let's say the seller had agreed, hey, Mike, you and your team are going to sell our home. We're going to give you $20,000. They were explained, we're going to use a portion of that to compensate the buyer's agent, buyer's brokerage, because let's face it, the buyer's bringing all of the money to make this transaction happen. And the $20,000 is typically coming out of the seller's proceeds. So in this case, we have negotiated, for example, me and my team are going to take $12,000 of that as our fee for service, and then we would share, give cooperating compensation of $8,000 to that buyer's agent, buyer's brokerage. So that is no longer happening. There is no sharing of commissions. So when we're signing listing agreements now, it's very clear, here's the listing side commission, think of commission as a fee for service, and then now the seller has options whether or not they want to offer commission to a buyer's agent. So you'll see we've got 4 scenarios of how that'll be paid going forward. To recap quickly though, before, seller pays selling broker or listing broker, I should say, and then a portion of that total would go to the buyer's agent. Buyer's not coming out of pocket for any of the fees for their buyer's agent in that scenario. Going forward, one of 4 things will happen. So the seller, let's say they agree, Mike, we're going to pay you and your team $12,000 for your side of what you're going to do for us. But we're willing to compensate that buyer's agent because maybe to qualify for their loan, they can't afford to pay their representation, but we want professionals on both sides of the transaction. So they agree that out of their proceeds, they will pay $8,000 towards that buyer's agent. So you'll see the arrow, seller to listing agent, and then seller straight to buyer. Scenario 2 is seller says, I'll pay you for your services. We're not going to pay a buyer's agent anything. If the buyer is signing an agreement with their representation, they understand they may have to pay this. We're not going to pay it at all. In that case, the money flow goes seller to listing agent for the $12,000, and then the buyer would be on the hook to pay that $8,000 to their buyer's agent or brokerage. Again, we could go down a rabbit hole of what's the best strategy, but that's one of them. The third scenario is the seller says, yep, we're going to pay that $12,000 and we'll give a portion towards the buyer's agent to help make sure the transaction gets done, and the buyer will bring the difference. So there you've got an arrow coming from the seller to the buyer's agent and from the buyer to the buyer's agent. The fourth scenario, which is kind of a bit of a derivation of the first one, would be where the seller gives a concession to the buyer, and then the buyer uses that concession to pay their agent. So the money would go from the seller to the buyer, and then the buyer to the buyer's agent. So that's the way it is going forward. So now when we're presenting offers to sellers, we're presenting both, hey, here are the terms for the purchase of the home, and then there's an extra form where the buyer's agent is typically requesting some compensation or a concession from the seller to cover that portion of it so that the buyer is not having to come up with so many additional funds in addition to the closing costs that they're going to have to pay. All negotiable. Funny thing is, it always has been. But when there was that cooperating compensation, the brokers were predetermining what that commission to a buyer's agent would be. That's no longer the case, and you'll notice on the graph that there's nothing going from listing agent or listing broker to buyer's agent or buyer's broker anymore. This is now called either seller-directed or buyer-directed compensation. Hope that demystifies it. Hope that helps you understand what a decoupling of commission looks like. So now we'll go on to the third point. So the third change we talked about is there's no longer offers of compensation in the industry database, if you will, the MLS. You'll hear agents all the time talk about the MLS, the multiple listing service. So there's hundreds of these across the country. We happen to belong to the Northeast Florida Association of Realtors, or Northeast Florida Multiple Listing Service, which is a great service. It's a warehouse of data of homes that have sold, homes that haven't sold, homes that are on the market, homes that are coming soon. So only licensed real estate professionals have access to this multiple listing service. So no longer can that listing broker advertise what the buyer agent compensation will be for a certain property. It used to be, again, we'd sign that listing agreement, $12,000 to the listing broker, offering $8,000 to the buyer's broker. That was publicly available. It was usually shown as a percentage of the price that the buyer agent compensation was going to be. That can no longer be advertised in our MLS in any way. There are fines that are being handed out for this today, and we're only a couple days into this new normal that we're living in. However, agents can advertise broker agent compensation in other mediums, social media, their own website, email communication to other agents, where they may say, hey, buyer is offering 2.5%, buyer is offering 3% buyer agent compensation. Like we discussed going through the 4 scenarios, there's no right or wrong way to determine A, what that number will be, or B, how to communicate that to agents. We have a strategy I'm happy to share that we're sharing on our listings to let agents on the other side know, buyers agents that are inquiring, that sellers are open to it, but listing agents and brokers are not under an obligation to share what that number is, because again, everything is now negotiable. So no advertising of buyer agent compensation, that has gone away. It is no longer in the MLS. Agents are having to communicate a little bit more on the front side. And then buyers agents, when they're having those initial intakes and consultations with buyer clients, are explaining it's possible that properties that you're interested in will not offer to help with my compensation. Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, are you comfortable in that case, if you see a home you love, understanding that you may be coming out of pocket to pay for my fees and fees for service, if you will. So those discussions, I think, really should have been happening all along, but now everybody's understanding the process a whole lot more upfront, which I think honestly is very helpful to everyone involved. So now in typical high school essay format, I told you what I was going to tell you. I told you. Now a quick recap. So number 1, buyers are entering into formal relationships with their representation earlier in the process than in the past. On the listing side, nothing has really changed other than a little more transparency that the fee for service is going to be for the listing agent only at this point. Number 2, no more shared or cooperating compensation. As part of the offer, that third agreement, that purchase agreement, that's where buyer side compensation is going to be addressed and negotiated. And number 3, there are no more offers of compensation in the MLS. From a consumer standpoint, probably doesn't change a whole lot. The first 2, I do think, change things a little bit. If you've bought a home before and now you're going to buy again, you may be put off or caught off guard a little bit by your agent advising, hey, before we go see 123 Main Street, we need to sit down, help you understand what my representation looks like, what that costs, how I may be compensated for that. So I think now's a good time to cover what I would call the top 5 questions that we're getting. So let's walk through those one at a time, the top 5 questions about the new post-August 17th world. So question number 1, are commissions fixed or set? They're negotiable. Interestingly, they always have been. There just hadn't been the transparency around that. That, again, was a real reason that these lawsuits ended up coming forward against the National Association of Realtors, and the settlement addressed how to improve and make things more transparent. So they're negotiable on both sides. We offer, on the listing side, for example, we offer 3 levels of service, 3 levels of marketing to our sellers to say, hey, which is going to fit best for you, which makes the most sense for your property. And those are on a sliding scale of price points as well. So commissions, not fixed, not set. Negotiable, always have been, always will be on both sides. So question number 2, I heard I don't have to pay commissions anymore. So this is great clickbait. Not entirely true, but it kind of is. So you never had an obligation to work with a professional to sell your home. Think of somebody that does it for sale by owner. They sell it to a family member. So without representation, no, you would not have to pay commissions. However, to work with a licensed realtor, team of professionals, there are fees for services. So understand that the buyer side now, that commission, that fee for service could either come from the seller or from the buyer, but it is no longer going to come from the listing broker to that buyer's broker. That's where the decoupling comes into play. So can you buy or sell a home without a professional and commissions? Absolutely. As a real estate professional and somebody who's bought and sold several homes even before I got into real estate, would not advise it. It's a very complex transaction. There are a lot of moving parts, a lot of people that are involved, a lot of vendor partners, a lot of professionals to opine on the systems of the home, the condition of the home, air quality, you name it, rules and regulations, dealing with condo boards, understanding HOA restrictions. All of these things are where the realtors are earning their money. So again, don't have to pay it. So question 3 is around that buyer representation or buyer's broker's agreement. Do I have to sign that to go see a property I want to see? The short answer is yes. That is now a requirement that realtors have. The one exception, the one caveat would be an open house. For example, if there's an open house that's advertised, typically there's going to be a representative of that listing brokerage that's representing the seller to open the property. It's advertised as a public event. You can go ask questions. We advise, if you are working with a real estate professional, let that listing agent, that listing broker, whoever's hosting the open house know, hey, I'm working with Mike and his team, just so they understand that you already have entered into a buyer's rep agreement. It'll make things a lot smoother for everyone. But to see properties, and that includes actually virtual showings. We do a lot of relocation here, so we're having that conversation up front about to send you that video to go do that virtual showing. We're actually going to have to formalize this relationship so we both understand what our roles are in the process. So question 4 is, does this apply only in certain markets or certain types of properties? We covered it a little bit at the top. Residential real estate all across the United States. These new rules and these process upgrades and updates have taken effect August 17th. So it is nationwide for the US. Final question we get is, can I just work with the agent I already know and love? Absolutely. And we encourage that. Just understand that if you've been working together, maybe you've toured some properties and now you would put your search on pause and now you're re-engaging and a buyer rep agreement had not been presented or signed before you go see that next property going forward, that's where that buyer rep agent agreement will need to be signed. If you've hung in till the end, first of all, thank you. My hope for this video was just to give some clarity around the noise and what is happening, and also help you understand what does it look like August, September, going forward, 2024 and beyond. What is it going to look like to engage the services of real estate professionals, whether you're looking to sell your home whether you're looking to buy a home. And obviously, if you're in Northeast Florida, Jacksonville, Ponte Vedra Beach, Nocatee, the Jacksonville Beaches, even up into Fernandina, Yulee, we would love to be a resource and help you understand what this process looks like and how we've been able to help hundreds just like you achieve that dream of either selling a home or buying a home in today's market. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you got value.